If you try to find the exact physical boundary of a wooden desk, like the absolute microscopic line where the desk definitively ends and the surrounding air begins, modern physics tells us it doesn't actually exist.
Right, exactly. At the subatomic level, it's just this hazy cloud of probability. It's a negotiation of forces rather than a solid wall.
Yeah, but our human brains violently insist that the boundary is there. We demand solid borders. We navigate the whole world by drawing these strict lines around objects and events.
It is a massive cognitive dissonance. I mean, we live in this incredibly fluid, continuous universe, but we perceive it as a collection of chunky, isolated things that just start, stay for a while, and then abruptly end.
We're totally addicted to those boundaries.
We really are.
Well, welcome back to the conversation, everyone. If you're joining us today for this deep dive, we are assuming you've already survived the intellectual gauntlet of our previous ones.
Yeah, you've waded through the mind-bending deconstruction of causality in Chapter 1.
You've watched motion get logically dismantled in Chapter 2.
And you've had your very sense of perception turned inside out in Chapter 3. So you
Right.
know the territory.
Exactly. You know the philosopher we're dealing with, the 2nd century thinker Nāgārjuna, and you know that his logic leaves absolutely no stone unturned.
So today we are turning that philosophical microscope toward a totally new target.
Right, because in previous chapters, we focused on invisible forces, like the hidden mechanism of a cause turning into an effect.
Or the imperceptible mechanics of a perceiver perceiving.
Right.
But today, in Chapter 7 of the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, we are targeting the physical world you interact with every single day. We are looking at macroscopic composites.
The Sanskrit term is saṃskṛta. We're talking about the everyday, chunky physical things.
Yeah, the wooden desk you're sitting at, the car parked in your driveway.
The ceramic coffee mug in your hand, or like the massive oak tree in your backyard.
And we aren't just looking at the objects themselves. We're analyzing the 3 defining stages of their existence.
Right.
According to the foundational philosophies of Nāgārjuna's time, specifically the Abhidharmika schools, any conditioned thing, any composite, must undergo 3 distinct phases.
And those are origination, duration, and cessation, right?
Exactly. First, origination, it has to begin. Second, duration, it has to endure or stay a while. And third, cessation, it must eventually end or be destroyed.
Origination, duration, and cessation. I mean, those 3 words basically sum up the entire human experience.
They really do. It's the story arc of everything we care about.
And my promise to you, the listener, as we embark on this, is actually quite heavy.
Is a big promise.
Yeah. Because if we follow this logic all the way to the bottom, the crushing burden of your past regrets, the things that have supposedly ceased, and that tight, knotty anxiety you feel about the future, the things that have yet to originate, they might just systematically dissolve.
Because the very concepts of past, present, and future are about to be logically taken apart down to the studs.
It's an ambitious claim to say philosophy can cure anxiety.
It is. But that is the ultimate goal of the Madhyamaka framework. And to get to that state of freedom, we first have to deeply understand the trap we're currently caught in.
And that trap starts entirely with biology, doesn't it?
100%.
So I want you to do something intensely physical right now, wherever you're listening. Just reach out and firmly tap something solid. Go ahead, actually do it. Tap a solid wooden desk or smack the leather steering wheel of your car.
Just listen to the sound it makes. Feel that undeniable resistance pushing back against your knuckles.
Notice what your brain does in that exact fraction of a second. It registers a definitively binary state.
Right. It tells you there's a strict, uncrossable border. Your hand ends and the desk begins.
The ambient silence ends and the sharp tapping noise begins. There is absolutely no gray area in your perception of that impact.
And that's because our nervous systems didn't evolve to sit around pondering the fluid, interconnected tapestry of a subatomic cosmos.
No, they evolved to keep us from getting eaten by predators.
Exactly. We developed a biological mechanism called edge detection. To survive on the savanna, a primate's visual cortex had to instantly draw a hard, absolute boundary between, say, the concept of a tiger and the concept of the tall grass the tiger was hiding in.
Because if you couldn't detect that edge instantly, you didn't survive to pass on your genes.
Right. The caloric energy required for the human brain to process lines, shadows, contrast, and depth just to define the boundary of an apple sitting on a table is staggering.
It's a biological survival imperative. But the philosophers of the Madhyamaka tradition identified a catastrophic side effect of this biology.
They called it the disease of reification.
Reification. It basically means taking something that is inherently fluid, abstract, or interconnected, and mentally freezing it into a solid, independent, absolute thing.
We hallucinate concrete reality where there is only process.
Because our visual cortex is so incredibly efficient at detecting physical edges, our higher reasoning just assumes the universe itself operates as a neat set of binary opposites.
We take deeply interconnected processes, like a seed growing into a tree over decades, and we freeze them into solid, independent categories.
We assume existence and non-existence, or origination and cessation, are strictly separated. We want reality to look like an X-ray of a broken bone.
Yeah, that jagged white line against a dark background. It's either broken or it's not broken. Clean, simple, binary.
But the physical universe absolutely refuses to behave like that X-ray.
It does. And to cure this cognitive disease of reification, Nāgārjuna applies a highly systematic diagnostic. We have to map out the conceptual landscape we are projecting onto the world.
Right, because whenever we look at a composite object, say, that desk you just tapped, we are actually projecting a triad of concepts. Let's lay out those three concepts.
Okay, so first we project the characteristics themselves. As we mentioned, these are origination, duration, and cessation.
Second, there is the action. This is the cognitive act of characterizing, the mental or physical process of defining the boundary.
And third, there's the characterized object, the desk itself, the composite.
Now, when I try to apply this to my daily life, I immediately run into a wall of frustration.
How so?
Let's look at a tomato plant in my garden. Conventionally, I absolutely rely on those three categories. I plant a seed in the spring, I watch it originate as a sprout, it stays a while, it endures through the summer heat, it produces tomatoes.
Right.
And then, when the first frost hits in November, it dies. It ceases. Are we seriously suggesting that this incredibly obvious biological sequence is a hallucination?
Well, no. Nobody is denying your tomatoes.
Okay.
Nāgārjuna is not a nihilist, and he's definitely not saying the conventional world doesn't function.
Okay, good.
The functionality of the seed sprouting, growing, and dying is undeniably real on a relative level. The critical distinction here is what we mean by the word real.
Right. Nāgārjuna is asking a much more invasive question. He's asking, do those three stages, origination, duration, and cessation, possess an absolute inherent essence?
Precisely. The Sanskrit term is svabhava. Does origination have its own solid core? Is there an isolated independent entity called the beginning that acts upon the seed?
So we aren't testing whether the tomato plant grows. We are testing if the philosophical categories we use to describe that growth are fundamentally independently real.
Exactly. And to test for that absolute essence, we use the heavy machinery of the Madhyamaka framework, the tetralemma, the four-cornered logic.
Right, because Western logic generally offers a dilemma. Two horns, A or B, true or false.
But the tetralemma provides four corners to exhaust literally every single conceptual hiding place the human ego might retreat to.
We analyze these characteristics by asking, are they existent, non-existent, both, or neither?
And are they identical to the object, completely different from the object, both or neither?
Let's apply this directly to the first characteristic, origination. Verses 1 through 20 of Chapter 7 are entirely dedicated to tearing apart the idea that a beginning inherently exists.
It is a relentless logical assault. We start by looking for the cause of this supposed origination.
Right. If the origination of my tomato plant is an absolute inherently existing thing, like a tangible force that brings the plant into reality, how does that force itself come into being?
Does origination self-originate? Or is it caused by something entirely different from itself? Let's take the first option.
Okay, so if we claim that origination self-originates, meaning the act of beginning simply begins itself, we crash headfirst into an infinite regress.
We do. And an infinite regress destroys the possibility of anything ever happening. Here is the mechanical breakdown of that. If origination is an inherently real, compounded thing, then according to the Abhidharmika rules, it too must possess the three characteristics of a thing.
It must have its own origination, its own duration, and its own cessation.
Yes. So to have the basic origination of the tomato plant, you require an origination of the origination to quickstart it.
And what starts that secondary origination? A tertiary origination. It's turtles all the way down.
It really is. If every beginning requires another beginning to start it, the sequence mathematically never reaches the actual plant. The process is paralyzed in an infinite loop of pre-beginnings. Therefore, self-origination is logically impossible.
Okay, so the opponent in Nāgārjuna's time says, fine, it doesn't self-originate, it other-originates. The secondary origination of the origination is a totally separate entity that causes the basic origination.
But that retreat is equally disastrous. If you claim there are different entities, you create a vicious circular dependency.
Wait, how does that work?
Well, the opponent is arguing that the secondary origination produces the primary origination. But how can the secondary origination perform the action of producing the primary one if the secondary one hasn't yet been brought into existence by the primary one?
Oh, I see. It's a paradox. It's like a son giving birth to his own father.
Exactly. You have two entities that both require the other to exist before they can perform the action of creating the other. Furthermore, an entity that is currently unproduced has zero causal power. An unproduced origination cannot reach out and cause a product to arise.
So the opponents, realizing they are completely trapped here, deploy one of the most famous analogies in ancient Indian philosophy.
Yeah, they try to find a real-world example where something acts upon itself and other things simultaneously without needing an infinite regress. They present the analogy of the lamp.
I remember wrestling with this analogy when I first read the text because it is incredibly persuasive. It feels so intuitive.
What's their argument?
The opponent argues, look at a butter lamp in a dark room. A lit lamp doesn't need a second lamp to illuminate it. The nature of a lamp is to naturally illuminate both itself and the surrounding room at the exact same time. Therefore, origination is like the lamp. It gives rise to itself, and it gives rise to the object.
It's a brilliant defensive maneuver because it appeals directly to our everyday edge detection biology. We see a candle, we see the light, and we assume the logic holds.
But Nāgārjuna dismantles it with surgical precision.
He really does. He doesn't attack the lamp directly, he attacks the underlying definitions. He asks, what is the mechanical definition of illumination?
Well, illumination is the dispelling of darkness. Where there is light, darkness is removed.
Okay, now look closely at the physical flame of the lamp. Is there any darkness located within the flame itself?
No. By its very definition, fire is light. There is absolutely no darkness residing inside the flame.
If there is no darkness within the flame, then the flame cannot perform the action of dispelling darkness from itself. The action is rendered void. A thing cannot act upon an attribute that is not there.
Wow.
Therefore, it's a logical fallacy to say the lamp illuminates itself. The analogy fails on its own primary premise.
That is devastating. Fire doesn't illuminate itself because it's never covered in darkness to begin with. You can't clean a plate that has zero dirt on it.
But Nāgārjuna doesn't stop there. He goes after the second half of the analogy, the idea that the lamp illuminates the room.
Right.
He asks a spatial question. For the lamp to dispel the darkness in the room, does the light make physical contact with the darkness, or does it dispel it without making contact?
Okay, this feels like a trap. If I say the light makes contact with the darkness,
You contradict the laws of physics. Light and darkness cannot exist in the exact same spatial location at the exact same moment.
right, the moment light arrives, darkness is annihilated. They cannot touch because contact requires two existing entities pressing against each other.
Exactly. So the light does not make contact with the darkness. It dispels it from a distance.
But if you claim that an entity can causally destroy something without ever making contact with it, you destroy the boundaries of the universe.
Yes. If a lamp could dispel darkness without physically reaching it, then a single butter lamp lit in this room would instantaneously dispel all the darkness in the deepest trenches of the ocean and on the far side of the moon.
Because physical proximity and contact would no longer be requirements for causality.
Which is an absurdity. The logic completely implodes.
The lamp analogy is a beautiful piece of poetry, but mechanically it falls apart. And with it, the opponent's desperate hope that origination can self-cause or other cause is completely destroyed.
So we have established that the mechanism of origination is conceptually flawed. But Nāgārjuna pushes further into the temporal impossibility of a beginning.
This connects deeply with our previous deep dive on motion. If origination is a real, absolute event, we should be able to pinpoint exactly when it happens.
Where is the origination located in time? Let's take the tomato seed again. At what specific microsecond does the origination of the sprout occur?
We have to divide time into three states. The past, which is the already arisen, the future, the unarisen, and the present, the presently arising.
So can the action of origination happen to an entity that is unarisen?
No. If the sprout is completely unarisen, it doesn't exist yet. You can't perform an action on a non-existent void. There's nothing there for the origination to attach to.
Okay, can the action of origination happen to an entity that has already arisen?
Also no. If the sprout has already arisen, it is already here. Applying origination to it again is entirely redundant. It would be like painting a wall that is already painted the exact same color.
So our minds retreat to the only remaining safe haven, the present moment. We cling to the idea that origination is happening right now, to the presently arising entity.
But what is a presently arising entity? If we zoom in on that present moment with a philosophical microscope, the concept tears itself apart.
It does, because presently arising implies a duration of time where a thing is caught in a transitional state, half existent and half non-existent.
Right.
But if you try to freeze a single durationless microsecond of the present, nothing is actively changing inside that frozen frame. Change requires a sequence of frames. A single frame contains no action.
If you take a photograph of a race car moving at 200 miles an hour, in the exact fraction of a second captured in that photo, the car is perfectly still. There is no arising happening within the frozen present.
And if you string multiple frozen presents together, you are just looking at a series of pasts and futures. You can never locate the active, absolute moment of origination.
The temporal search yields nothing. Verses 1 through 20 mathematically eliminate the possibility of an inherent absolute beginning.
Origination cannot be found in the mechanism of causality, and it cannot be found in the flow of time. It is empty of inherent essence.
This is deeply unsettling, honestly, but we have to keep moving through the diagnostic. We've dismantled the beginning, let's look at the middle, let's tackle duration or change.
Verses 21 through 25 focus on this.
Even if we can't find the exact moment the tomato plant starts, it obviously stays in my garden for 3 months. It endures. How can duration be a false absolute?
Well, to have an absolute inherent essence of duration, an object would have to possess a static, unchanging core of staying. It would need a hardened nugget of persistence that remains identical from one moment to the next.
But this directly violates the most observable universal law of impermanence.
Exactly. Everything is in a state of decay or transformation.
Mountains are eroding by fractions of a millimeter. Human cells are dying and regenerating. The metal on my car is slowly oxidizing and rusting.
If every single macroscopic composite in the universe is subject to continuous aging, decay, and eventual death, a static, unchanging essence of duration is impossible.
Think about the temporal mechanics of staying versus changing. If duration were an absolute entity, completely separate from change, then the universe would be paralyzed.
If a desk had an absolute essence of enduring, it would be impervious to the universe. It could never be destroyed. It could never be burned for firewood. It could never even accumulate dust, because accumulating dust is a change in state.
Right. For duration to be measurable, it requires the passage of time. And the passage of time is measured purely by change. You only know the desk has endured for 10 years because you can measure the slight fading of the varnish or the microscopic wear on the edges.
Therefore, duration is entirely dependent on its supposed opposite, decay. It cannot be an independent, self-sustaining essence.
The harder you try to isolate staying, the more it slips through your fingers. It's like trying to hold onto a handful of water by clenching your fist really tight. The pressure of your grip is what forces the water out.
By trying to freeze duration into an absolute, you destroy the very concept of it. Duration is fundamentally empty.
Which brings us to the final, and perhaps most psychologically terrifying characteristic cessation. The ending.
Verses 26 through 32 of the text are dedicated to dismantling death itself.
The human mind is terrified of cessation. We reify it into this massive, dark, absolute wall at the end of the timeline. We view the death of a plant or a person or a star as a definitive, inherent event.
But we must run cessation through the exact same temporal stress test we used for origination. Ask yourself, can you apply the action of ceasing to an entity that has already ceased?
No, because there is no entity left to apply the action to. Verse 31 of Nāgārjuna's text provides a brutally visceral analogy for this. He says trying to cease a non-existent thing is like trying to perform a second decapitation.
Exactly. You cannot cut off the head of a corpse that has already been beheaded. There's nothing left to cut. The action is impossible.
So we look to the unceased entity. Can you apply the action of ceasing to an entity that has not yet ceased?
No, because by definition, an entity that has not yet ceased is currently enduring. If it is enduring, it is actively possessing the characteristic of duration. It cannot simultaneously possess the characteristic of cessation.
We return to the frozen present. Can you cease a presently ceasing entity? We already proved that a frozen durationless moment contains no active change. The action cannot be found.
But Nāgārjuna introduces another profound logical layer here, regarding the very nature of existence. Can an existent thing truly cease?
What do you mean? If something exists, doesn't it have to eventually not exist?
Conventionally, yes.
Yeah.
But we are searching for absolute essences. If an object possesses the absolute inherent property of being, it cannot logically transition into non-being.
Oh, because the properties of being and non-being are mutually exclusive?
Right, they cannot coincide in the exact same object. If its absolute nature is to exist, forcing it to non-exist requires destroying its absolute nature, which makes it non-absolute.
This forces us into a paradox about causality again. Just like origination, cessation cannot be self-caused. An entity cannot forcefully exert energy to cause its own complete non-entity. The act of causing requires presence.
And cessation cannot be caused by another separate entity either. If the destroyer and the destroyed are absolutely different independent entities, they have no point of contact.
An absolute gap exists between them. A hammer cannot smash a glass if the hammer and the glass exist in fundamentally separate, independent spheres of reality.
So we have spent an intense amount of time applying the tetralemma, and the result is total conceptual devastation.
We have systematically, mathematically eliminated the logical possibility of origination, duration, and cessation possessing any independent, absolute essences.
The three defining stages of the macroscopic universe have been dismantled.
Which brings up a very serious existential problem. When you walk a listener through this level of deconstruction, the immediate psychological reaction is vertigo.
It kind of feels like stepping off a cliff, honestly.
If these stages don't inherently exist, are we just left grasping at empty air? Have we just proved that the universe is a dark, meaningless void where nothing begins, nothing stays, and nothing ends? Is this just the ultimate form of nihilism?
That vertigo is the most common reaction, and it is the exact danger Nāgārjuna anticipated. But the answer to your question leads us to the most beautiful, vital pivot in the entire philosophical framework. Emptiness is not a black hole.
The text forces us to draw a different conclusion from our diagnostic. We arrive at the realization of emptiness of inherent existence.
Right, the Sanskrit word we touched on earlier, svabhava, translates to own being, or inherent essence.
Because every extreme of the tetralemma leads to a logical absurdity, we are forced to conclude that the three spheres, the characteristics, the action, and the composite object are completely empty of svabhava.
They lack a standalone, independent core.
But as you said, emptiness is not a cosmic vacuum cleaner that sucks away reality, leaving us in a dark void. Emptiness simply means an absence of false absolutes.
If they are empty of absolute independence, what are they full of? They are full of each other. This is the doctrine of dependent co-origination. From this profound emptiness, we conclude that all things are dependently co-arisen. The characteristics origination, duration, cessation, and the characterized object, the desk, the tree rely entirely, 100%, upon one another. They are mutually co-imputed by the human mind.
I want to explore the parent and child analogy here because I think it is the perfect tool to understand how things can exist dependently without having an absolute core.
It's an incredibly precise analogy. Consider the identity of a parent. Can you locate the absolute independent essence of a parent floating in a dark vacuum, completely isolated from the rest of the universe?
No. The identity of a parent is strictly defined by the existence of a child. You cannot be a parent unless a child exists.
And similarly, you cannot be a child unless a parent exists. Now look at the timeline of those identities. Does the parent sequentially cause the child in absolute isolation?
No. The exact fraction of a second a child is born, the identity of the parent is simultaneously born. They co-arise. They are mutually dependent concepts.
They lean against each other. Without one, the other vanishes.
So origination, duration, and cessation co-define each other in the exact same manner.
Exactly. You cannot construct the concept of an ending without relying entirely on the concept of a beginning. You cannot understand duration without drawing mental boundaries of origination and cessation to define what is enduring.
They are like three sheaves of reeds leaning against one another in a field. If you pull even one away, the entire structure collapses. They have no individual foundation.
This realization completely flips the script on nihilism.
It really does. When I finally grasped this, it was a massive breakthrough. The emptiness of the object is not what destroys it. The emptiness of the object is the exact prerequisite that allows it to function.
Emptiness is the engine of functionality.
Let's go back to the car parked in my driveway. If that car actually possessed a solid, absolute, indestructible essence of stillness, if its lack of motion was an absolute property inherent to its atomic structure, it could never, ever move.
Right. It would be locked in an eternal stasis. An absolute cannot be altered.
Exactly. If stillness were absolute, turning the ignition key and starting the engine would require me to destroy an indestructible absolute truth of the universe, which is fundamentally impossible.
So the fact that the car is empty of absolute stillness is the exact reason you can put it in drive and go to the grocery store.
Its lack of essence is its potential to change.
This is a perfect articulation of the union of the two truths. The Madhyamaka framework operates on two levels simultaneously. We have the conventional truth, truth one, which is your car driving to the store, the tomato seed growing into a plant, the functional reality of daily life.
And we have the ultimate truth, truth two, which is the complete emptiness of inherent existence of that car and that seed.
They aren't in conflict. They seamlessly unite. One relies entirely on the other.
If things weren't empty, they'd be paralyzed. Emptiness provides the necessary breathing room for the universe to operate. It is what allows the gears of causality to turn without locking up.
But as soon as we establish the beauty of emptiness and dependent origination, we have to issue a severe philosophical warning. Nāgārjuna is acutely aware of how desperately the human ego wants to cling to something solid.
Human psychology abhors a vacuum.
It truly does. When we use this diagnostic to strip away the absolute reality of the physical world, the mind panics. It looks around for a new absolute to grab onto, and it often targets the cure itself.
It takes the concept of emptiness and reifies it.
Yes, it turns emptiness into a giant, featureless cosmic soup, a glowing fundamental truth that underlies reality. It turns it into a new religion.
It's like realizing the monster in the closet is fake, but then deciding that the fakeness is a new monster you have to worship.
That is exactly what happens. But Nāgārjuna insists that the cure cannot become a new poison. We must apply the diagnostic to the diagnostic. Emptiness and dependent origination are themselves dependently arisen concepts.
They are tools co-imputed by the mind to counter the disease of reification. Once the disease is cured, you don't keep swallowing the medicine. Emptiness is also empty.
If emptiness is empty and all macroscopic composites are dependently co-arisen, we arrive at the realization of illusory nature.
The things we interact with are there, yet not there. They function perfectly, but they possess no solid core. They are like a reflection in a mirror, a mirage on a highway, or an echo in a canyon.
The canyon echo is a very useful analogy.
Let's trace it. If I stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon and shout, a sound wave travels across the expanse. That sound wave is conventionally real. It is a physical vibration of air molecules. It might functionally scare a bird off a cliff ledge. But if I hack down into the canyon and try to physically grab that echo with my bare hands, I just catch empty air. I cannot locate the echo as an independent entity. It is an interdependent event, a temporary meeting of lungs, vocal cords, air pressure, and rock formations.
It is conventionally functional, but ultimately ungraspable.
But I want to press you on this, because this is where the philosophy meets painful reality. An echo is harmless. A reflection in a mirror won't hurt me. But if I am running down the street and I crash headfirst into a brick wall, my nose breaks.
Yeah.
The pain is agonizingly real. The blood dripping down my face is real. The massive hospital bill I receive a week later is entirely real. How can anyone sit there and tell me that a brick wall is an illusion or just an echo?
This is the most vital misunderstanding to clarify in this entire philosophical system. When Madhyamaka says the brick wall is an illusion, it is absolutely not saying the wall is a hallucination. It is not denying the laws of physics or biology.
So the physics of the broken nose are real?
Conventionally, yes. The blood, the pain signals shooting up your nervous system, the density of the brick. These are a vast, complex web of dependent conditions operating perfectly under conventional physical laws.
Okay.
The biological matter of your nose interacts with the atomic structure of the brick, triggering an evolutionary pain response designed to keep you alive. That is dependent origination in real-time action.
If the physics are real, what part of the wall is the illusion?
The illusion is what your mind adds to the physics. Your mind takes that temporary fluid aggregation of atoms, electromagnetic forces, and sensory data, and in a fraction of a microsecond, it slaps a label on it.
Right.
It imputes an eternal absolute concept of wallness onto that space. It assumes the wall exists from its own side, totally independent of the atoms, your perception, or the passage of time.
My mind creates a platonic ideal of a wall and superimposes it over the cloud of atoms.
Exactly. The absolute wall is the illusion. You broke your nose on a temporary, rapidly changing aggregation of conditions, not on an independent, self-existing entity. The pain is a dependent event. The absolute wall is a mental fabrication.
Okay, that makes sense. The illusion isn't that nothing is there. The illusion is that a solid, permanent thing is there.
Correct.
But this realization creates a massive structural problem for how we communicate. If the entire universe, the walls, the cars, the tomato plants, is a functional mirage co-created by our minds and conditions, how can we even talk about it without lying?
You are hitting the limits of language. Language is inherently dualistic.
Every sentence I speak requires a subject and an object. My grammar demands that things be solid. To apply the generalized tetralemma to the entire universe, Nāgārjuna says that any object or duality is not this, not non-this, not both, and not neither. He systematically negates every possible category.
He forces a total conceptual collapse.
If I say the tree is tall, I am grammatically separating the tree from its tallness. I am reifying a duality. If I can't construct a sentence without creating a false absolute distinction, my grammar breaks. How do I even order a cup of coffee at a cafe without violating the fundamental nature of reality?
You order the coffee by recognizing what language actually is. Language is merely a conventional pointer. The map is not the territory it describes. The menu is not the meal.
Right. The word water is a sound made by vocal cords. It cannot quench your thirst.
So the language isn't the problem. The belief in the language is the problem.
Oh, I see.
Precisely. Your grammar only breaks if you stubbornly believe that your grammar perfectly and absolutely describes ultimate reality. If you recognize language as a clumsy, highly functional tool for navigating a dependent mirage, you can use it freely. You don't have to speak in riddles. This pragmatic realization forces us to adopt the middle way.
The middle way. This is the core attitude we are supposed to adopt after surviving the logic. We must find a path completely free from the four extreme views.
Let's outline those extremes so we know what we are avoiding. First, we reject objectivism and realism, the naive idea that physical objects exist solidly and independently out there, entirely separate from our observation.
Second, we reject subjectivism, idealism, and solipsism, the equally extreme idea that nothing physically exists, or that the entire universe is just a hallucination trapped inside my own head. We also reject nihilism, the dark, apathetic view that nothing matters.
Third, we reject dualism and pluralism, the idea that the universe is made of fundamentally separate, disconnected entities bumping into each other.
And crucially, fourth, we reject monism and radical oneness, the New Age idea that the universe is just one giant, featureless blob where everything is exactly the same thing.
The middle way navigates between all of these ditches.
I have a visual analogy for the middle way that helped me immensely. A lot of people hear the phrase middle way and they picture a straight, rigid white line painted on the ground. They think walking the middle way means standing perfectly frozen in the exact center of that line, refusing to move left or right, refusing to make any choices at all.
Paralyzed by philosophy. Unable to engage with life.
But the middle way isn't standing still. It's riding a bicycle. When you ride a bike, you are constantly falling and constantly correcting. It is the dynamic, continuous micro-adjustments of pedaling.
Exactly.
If you lean too far to the right, into eternalism, grasping at objects and demanding they stay permanent, gravity pulls you down and you crash into suffering.
And if you lean too far to the left, into nihilism, deciding that because things are empty, they don't matter, you lose all momentum and you crash into apathy and depression.
The middle way is fluid balance. You navigate the gravity of the relative world by constantly adjusting. You participate in the flow of life without trying to freeze it. You pedal through the mirage.
The bicycle analogy perfectly illustrates the next phase of the diagnostic acting without acting in the conventional world.
This is where we bring the heavy philosophy down to the pavement. Riding the bike of philosophy in a quiet room is great, but tomorrow morning I have to go to work. How do I handle a brutal, high-stakes corporate meeting or a soul-crushing hour-long traffic jam with this mindset? How do I use these concepts conventionally when the pressure is on?
You do not retreat to a cave. You engage. We must use dualities and concepts to navigate the relative world, but we use them without the heavy anchor of absolute belief.
Okay.
You go to the corporate meeting. You negotiate the contract. You try to win. You act while continuously maintaining the quiet underlying awareness of the empty nature of the action.
I think of this like playing an incredibly immersive video game. Let's use Elden Ring as an analogy. It is a notoriously brutal, difficult, high-stakes game.
Oh, absolutely.
When you are sitting on your couch fighting a massive, terrifying dragon in Elden Ring, you are locked in. You play by the rigid rules of the game's physics engine. You strategize. You time your dodges perfectly. Your heart rate genuinely spikes. Your palms sweat. You deeply conventionally care about surviving that boss fight.
Within the context of the game, you are fully utilizing the dualities of winning and losing, living and dying, attacking and defending.
But inevitably you miss a dodge. The dragon breathes fire, your character is incinerated, and that giant red "you died" text appears on your screen. You might feel a flash of conventional frustration, but you don't suffer true existential trauma. Your core identity is not crushed. You don't call the police to report a murder, and you don't mourn the digital character.
Why? Because underneath the intense physiological and emotional engagement of the gameplay, you never lost the ultimate awareness that the dragon is made of pixels. The fire is lines of code. The death is a reset mechanic.
You act without acting. You engage passionately in the mirage without ever reifying it as absolute reality. That is how you handle the corporate meeting.
It's the exact same mechanism. You advocate fiercely for your project at work because conventionally your salary, your team's livelihood, and your career progression depend on it.
Yeah.
To play the game. But if the project fails or the boss rejects your pitch, you don't reify that failure into a permanent, absolute stain on your inherent identity. You recognize the meeting, the boss, the company, and the failure as a temporary, fluid aggregation of empty conditions. The pixel dragon beats you. You put down the controller, and you remain whole.
There is an ancient metaphor that perfectly mirrors dropping the controller, the heavy raft.
Yes, the raft used to cross the river. In this philosophical framework, the concepts we use, origination, duration, cessation, even emptiness itself, are just logs tied together to make a raft. You use that conceptual raft to safely cross the raging, dangerous river of daily samsaric life.
Yeah.
The raft is vital. It keeps you from drowning in chaos.
But once you paddle across the river and reach the shore of deep understanding, what do? You step off the raft. You don't heave a massive waterlogged wooden raft onto your back and carry it through the forest for the rest of your life.
Carrying the raft means clinging to the philosophy as an absolute dogma. You drop the concepts. You drop the desperate need to constantly analyze everything into spheres and triads. You simply experience the world as it is.
So once you drop the raft, once you step onto that shore, what does the world actually look like? If it's not a collection of solid things and it's not a dark void, what is left?
This leads us to the culmination of the entire Madhyamaka reasoning: primordial equality, suchness, and oneness.
The grand finale of Chapter 7.
When you are finally freed from the tyrannical, desperate need to force reality into binary dualistic boxes, a profound shift in perception occurs. You look at everything, the individual person, the collective society, the sweeping cosmos, the beginning of a life, the cessation of a star, and you perceive them all as primordially equal. They are pure, perfect, complete, and one.
But we have to navigate a massive linguistic trap here, the word one.
It is the easiest place to stumble. When we say reality is one, we are strictly talking about non-dualism, meaning not many, not one, not both, and not neither. We are absolutely not talking about monism.
Right. It is not a giant cosmic blender that purees the entire universe into a featureless gray smoothie. If everything were literally one solid, undifferentiated blob, nothing could happen.
If reality were a featureless soup that erased all physical and conceptual boundaries, biological existence would instantly fail. Think about the physical act of getting bitten by a dog.
Okay.
If you were absolutely identically one with the dog, a dog bite could not physically occur. Teeth could not pierce skin because there would be no relative boundaries of density or space to cross. The mouth and the arm would be the same entity.
So what does non-dual oneness actually mean if it's not a smoothie?
It means reality is a luminous, unimaginably complex, interdependent web. Every single leaf on an oak tree is vividly unique. It has its own veins, its own specific shade of green, its own unique spatial location.
Yeah.
Yet despite that vivid diversity, every single leaf shares the exact same empty, interdependent nature. They are primordially equal in their emptiness. They are expressions of the same underlying, ungraspable process.
This connects back to a deeply profound quote from the source texts we reviewed. When you realize this primordial equality, you realize the truth behind the phrase, death is only the beginning.
It points to the fractal nature of the universe. Because we use the tetralemma to prove logically that there is no absolute origination and no absolute cessation, the hard boundaries of life and death blur into a continuous transformation.
When you throw a log on a campfire, you eventually witness what you conventionally call the cessation of the firewood. The wood turns to ash. But from the perspective of the universe, the cessation of the firewood is simultaneously the exact origination of the heat, the smoke, and the light.
It is a limitless, centerless, fractal karmic cycle. Every ending is just a transformation of energy and conditions into a new beginning. And because there is no absolute starting line and no absolute finish line, there is no real past, present, or future relative to anything. Time itself is revealed to be a conventional imputation, a measuring tape we lay over a fluid process.
Which resolves the ultimate, most stubborn duality in all of Eastern philosophy, the divide between samsara and nirvāṇa.
The cycle of suffering versus the state of total liberation.
Most people conceptualize nirvāṇa as an escape pod. They think of it as a separate heavenly dimension that you shoot off to when you finally beat the game of samsara. They think it's a completely different place.
But Madhyamaka logic proves conclusively that samsara and nirvāṇa are the exact same physical reality. There is zero ontological difference between the two states.
The suffering world is the exact same place as the liberated world. That is staggering to think about.
It is the ultimate paradigm shift. Nirvāṇa is simply samsara perceived without grasping. It is the exact same traffic jam, the exact same high-stakes corporate meeting, the exact same physical pain of a broken nose, but perceived with the ultimate wisdom of emptiness. When you stop desperately trying to freeze the river of reality into solid blocks of ice, you can finally swim in it.
I have to bring up a famous anecdote from the Zen tradition, the story of the master Huineng, because it perfectly encapsulates everything we've talked about today regarding the mind's role in this.
It is the perfect illustration.
The story goes that two monks are standing outside a temple, arguing violently about a flag blowing in the wind. One monk points and says, "The pennant is moving, the object is originating the motion."
Right.
The other monk shakes his head and says, "No, the invisible force of the wind is moving." They are trapped in the duality of the characterized object and the force acting upon it. The master, Huineng, walks by, listens to them argue, and simply says, "It is neither the wind nor the pennant that moves. It is your mind that moves."
That is the entire essence of Chapter 7, distilled into a few words. It is not the composite object, the desk, the tree, the car, that inherently arises, endures, or ceases. The universe is just a boundless, magnificent flow of transformation.
It's the mind that imputes the rigid edges.
It is the mind that hallucinates the static boundaries. It is the mind that moves, grasping desperately at origination and recoiling in terror at cessation. Stilling that mental imputation, dropping the habit of edge detection, is the realization of suchness, abiding in reality exactly as it is.
And if we carry this philosophy all the way through to its natural conclusion, it leads us to the most incredible, unforced ethical framework imaginable. It leads to spontaneous compassion.
If the boundary between self and other is ultimately a hallucination born of biological edge detection, if we understand that we are all temporary, interdependent expressions of the exact same web of conditions, then compassion is no longer a moral chore.
It's not a heavy commandment you have to force yourself to obey through sheer willpower.
No. Think about the physical mechanics of your own body. Imagine you were cooking, and your left hand accidentally brushes against a red-hot stove. What does your right hand do?
It immediately grabs the left arm and pulls it away.
Exactly. But notice what the right hand doesn't do. The right hand doesn't pause to debate the ethics of helping. It doesn't weigh the pros and cons. It doesn't blame the left hand for being clumsy, and it doesn't expect a reward for saving it. It pulls the left hand back instantly, spontaneously.
Because the right hand and the left hand realize they are part of the exact same interconnected system.
The pain of one is the pain of the whole.
To hurt another person or to ignore their suffering is causally equivalent to injecting poison into your own interdependent web. It is logically absurd. When you deeply, truly realize emptiness and the lack of a solid, independent self, helping others becomes as natural and instantaneous as saving your own arm from a fire.
When the illusion of ultimate separation collapses, what rushes in to fill that space is spontaneous, uncalculated, boundless compassion. It's a natural resting state of an empty universe.
This has been a massive, sweeping journey. We started with the humble mission of analyzing everyday macroscopic composites, desks, and tomato plants. We explored how our evolutionary biology forces us into the disease of reification. We mapped out the triad of characterization, and then we subjected it to the relentless stress test of the tetralemma.
We systematically proved that origination, duration, and cessation are mathematically and temporally impossible as absolute independent entities. They fail the test of causality, and they fail the test of time.
We stared into the void of nihilism and pivoted into the beautiful realization of dependent co-origination. We established that things exist as functional, karmic mirages, echoes in a canyon, completely empty of inherent essence, yet fully capable of operating in the conventional world. We learn to ride the bicycle of the middle way, acting without acting, engaging passionately in the video game of life without being crushed by the pixels.
We arrived at the understanding that reality is beyond all dualities, culminating in primordial equality and suchness.
And because there is no absolute origination, no absolute duration, and no absolute cessation, that heavy promise I made at the beginning of the hour holds true. The crushing burden of your past regrets and the suffocating anxiety of your future mathematically vanish.
They're conceptual ghosts.
They are empty imputations placed over a fluid reality. The past doesn't absolutely exist to haunt you, and the future doesn't absolutely exist to threaten you. You are free to engage fully, compassionately, in the luminous, interdependent web of the present.
As we wrap up this incredibly deep dive into the architecture of reality, I want to leave you with a final provocative challenge.
Yeah.
A practical experiment to explore on your own.
What's the assignment?
Tomorrow morning, when you first wake up, before you check your phone, before you start planning your day, I want you to quietly observe the exact machinery of your own mind. Don't judge what it does. Just watch it like a scientist observing a process.
Watching for the edge detection.
Exactly. Try to catch the fraction of a microsecond right before your mind imputes a solid concept onto the world. Watch that silent moment before it labels a sudden sound outside as annoying noise, or a physical sensation in your chest as anxiety, or a person you pass on the street as an absolutely separate other. Try to stretch out that moment, what actually exists in that silent, fluid, completely unlabeled gap, right before the mind moves to freeze the river.
Right before the mind moves. What a profound place to pause. Thank you for taking this plunge with us. We will see you on the next deep dive.